And it's a great honor to be back here to deliver this lecture at the VZB. I first came here in the 1990s to work with Friedhelm Neidhardt and Dieter Rucht, who is here, on social movements. VZB was then in the forefront of the revival of social movement studies, a field to which it is hoped it will return after a short period of relative silence. I want to offer my thanks to the Global Governance Unit and to Michael for the opportunity to return here. And I've learned a lot already in the short time I've been here. And may I make the most, I think, appropriate compliment, and that is I was invited to stay for a month. I only could stay for 2 weeks. I wish I had stayed longer, because there is so much to learn in this institution. There's so much interesting work going on, and the welcome that I've received is very gracious. This talk is not about global governance, but I will argue in closing that although it's about the United States, its lessons may travel, at least to Germany and possibly to other European states as well. I want to preface my remarks with both a confession and a hope. The confession is that I'm going to draw on the inspiration of other writers, legal scholar Rosa Brooks, for example, in her spirited essay, The Trickle-Down War, and comparativists like Wolfgang Streeck, Kathy Thielen, and Jim Mahoney, whose work on institutional change I hope to apply in this talk. My hope is that using this combination of legal and comparativist tools, I can contribute to our understanding of the long-term effects of the new kinds of wars of the 21st century on Western states. I also hope I can make a small contribution to the integration of international relations and historical institutionalism, a merger which I was delighted to discover when I arrived here is also being advanced by scholars connected with this institution. I'm going to try and propose an answer to the impossibly broad question: what happens to states when everything changes? In particular, I'll ask how a critical juncture, like September 11th, 2001, and the wars that followed, affected the American state. I'll argue that America may be moving towards a despotic state, not in the way that Germany did in 1933, but by a series of small-scale institutional mechanisms that operate beneath the surface. Such mechanisms are more difficult to discern than a dramatic shift to despotism, which is why they are so dangerous. I'll focus on the mechanism I call spillover, policy innovations that diffuse from one institutional sector to another. In the language of my colleague Suzanne Mettler, such changes are submerged in the sense that they do not involve major or direct changes in state practice. I'll argue that if America is moving towards a despotic state, it is not doing so in a Schmittian manner, but by spillovers from the national security state to other sectors of public policy. I'll examine 4 such examples: the militarization of the police, the expansion of a proxy state of military technological businesses, the growing use of secrecy in the courts, and the expanding suspicion and incarceration of immigrants. All these trends were visible before 9/11, but that critical juncture expanded their use to the point at which they're becoming threats to democracy. Let me begin with one of the great historical institutionalists, my mentor, Charles Tilly, and then turn first to Schmitt and then to my approach from historical institutionalism and end with the 4 examples of spillover. In his sweeping reconstruction of the history of European war-making, coercion, capital, and European states, Tilly argued that war affects state-building not through dramatic shifts to despotic power, but through civilian mechanisms like extraction, protection, distribution, production, and adjudication. The process in Europe was driven by a sequential spillover of innovations induced by war-making into domestic institutions. War required money, and expanding states needed to build mechanisms for the extraction of money and hire civil servants to collect taxes, keep records, build roads, educate future soldiers, and produce war material. This in turn led to the need for better services and so forth, until we arrive at the 20th century welfare state. Note that Tilly's paradigm didn't end with the creation of administrative institutions, as Otto Hintze long ago taught. In the process of institutional spillover, state builders also extended a tissue of economic, social, and political rights to citizens, who sometimes responded with compliance and nationalism, but sometimes with what Tilly called contentious politics. The result was a network of reciprocal rights and duties that would make it difficult for states to simply switch gears from a democratic, constitutional to a despotic state when they went to war. This figure graphically combines Tilly's paradigm of war and state building with his work on citizenship and contention. The lesson is obvious. Once institutions were created that embodied these mechanisms, states operated mainly through institutional adjustment and innovation, and only rarely through institutional change. Occasionally, there were critical junctures, wars, revolutions, economic crises, but these were mainly domesticated through the slower-moving mechanisms of institutional politics that I'll illustrate with the mechanism of spillover. But first, let me turn to Carl Schmitt and to the Schmittian reading of U.S. national security policy since 9/11. Ever since Kant and James Madison, observers have been aware of the danger that war poses to rights. Soon after 9/11, critics began to fear that America was heading down the path towards what Harold Lasswell called the garrison state. The launch of the war in Iraq intensified this fear. As Rosa Brooks writes, quote, "Historically, lawmakers have offered the executive branch far greater powers, and judges have afforded it far greater deference during wartime than during peacetime. The post-9/11 war on terrorism continued that trend." Brooks is a constitutional lawyer, and she may have been thinking of the 1944 Supreme Court Korematsu case, in which a Japanese American, Fred Korematsu, challenged the government's decision to send 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans to internment camps in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Supreme Court turned down Korematsu's petition. We now know that the decision was based on false and racist claims made by the Army officer in charge of the West Coast at the time. But fear of another attack led President Roosevelt to approve that move. Post 9/11, the fear of a recurrence of such unconstitutional decisions brought a resurgence of interest in the work of Schmitt, who, as you know, famously wrote that the sovereign is he who decides on the exception to the rule of law. From 1985, no, it's all right. When Schmitt's Political Theology was republished in English, reference to his work, particularly critical, more than doubled in America, as this analysis of Google Books shows. The fear of a Schmittian version was most evident in the work of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben in his 2004 book, The State of Exception. Agamben worried that the state of exception that followed 9/11 was, quote, a zone of anomie in which all legal determinations are deactivated. But it was also present in the work of legal scholars like Kim Lane Shepley, concerned by the security policy measures of the Bush administration. Shepley put together a script of 8 moves that states have used in the past to enforce emergency rule. Her emergency script included a sequence of executive centralization, militarization, taking procedural shortcuts, punitive detention, inversion of speech protection, reversal of transparency, anticipatory violence, and powers that linger after the emergency has passed. What my young friend Christian Kreuger-Sonnen, who is here, calls the ratchet effect. Immediately after 9/11, there was evidence for a Schmittian inversion with the passage of the USA Patriot Act. But the danger only became visible with the creation of an offshore prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, designed to put detainees out of the reach of American law, with the use of torture to extract information from detainees, with an expansion of the surveillance state to sweep up millions of bits of internet data, as the world learned from the revelations of Edward Snowden a decade later. Policymakers also created new institutions after 9/11. In the last months of 2001, 21 new state institutions were created, including what would become the Department of Homeland Security, which employs over 200,000 employees, and the Directorate of National Intelligence, which coordinates 16 separate intelligence agencies. In 2002, another 34 organizations were created. In 2003, 39, and an average of 30 per year in the next 5 years. The national security state was growing rapidly. To worried legal scholars like David Cole and Joseph Margulies, America seemed to be entering a new McCarthyism with the development of new forms of repression and surveillance. Cole focused first on what he called enemy aliens and on the repression of foreigners, but he hypothesized that this was about to spread to the repression of American citizens. Margulies, who defended the first group of Guantanamo detainees in the Supreme Court in the Russell case in 2004, feared that the military lawlessness that was governing Guantanamo was going to spread to the civilian courts as well. In my recent book, War, States, and Contention, I shared the concern of these scholars. But I also observed that the American state changes in far less dramatic ways. This is both because of the segmented nature of the state, but also because it operates largely through what social theorist Michael Mann called infrastructural power. The power of the state to penetrate and centrally coordinate the activities of civil society through its own infrastructure. And this he contrasted with despotic power, which is the power of the state over civil society. In the fog of war that followed 9/11, there were a number of infrastructural changes that in themselves did not appear dangerous. And this takes me to the work of the new school of comparative institutionalists. In the last decade, a growing body of work has come from a group of scholars in both Europe and America who've brought a historical institutional approach to the policy-making process. Policy, when I went to graduate school, was about as boring a field as you could find, because it was so completely detached from the study of power. The historical institutionalists, led by Strake and Phelan, have brought back policymaking to the analysis of power, and this is the promising and most creative part of their research. For scholars like Strake, Phelan, and Mahoney, changes in policy are the red thread that marks shifts in the configuration of power. Though most of their work is focused on social and economic policies and ignores national security, two key assumptions and one corollary from their work are relevant to this lecture. First, most of the time, in most places, institutional change occurs through what Strake and Phelan call gradual transformations, institutional discontinuity caused by incremental creeping change. But second, at times, states go through critical junctures, quote, moments in which uncertainty as to the future of an institutional arrangement allows for political agency and choice to play a decisive causal role in setting the institution on a certain path of development, a path that persists over a long period of time. Of these two assumptions, the corollary is that incremental change can follow from critical junctures. As Orfeo Fioritos observes in the context of his study of financial globalization in a recent book, which denizens of this institution will have seen already, and if not, they should, quote, the absence of a fundamental reform in the early post-crisis period should not be mistaken for an absence of important changes. The early years after the crisis constituted an intense period of incremental change. That 9/11 heralded a critical juncture for Americans is without doubt. It can be deduced from changes in public opinion, but also from an analysis of popular culture after 2001. References of 2001 in the press rose rapidly in 2002 and remained steady, except in the year of its 10th anniversary, when the numbers almost doubled. Mention 9/11 to virtually any American, and they will tell you where they were on that morning. It has the same status in Americans' memory as the murder of John F. Kennedy or Pearl Harbor. Americans seem almost obsessed with the memory of what happened on that day. But critical junctures also trigger incremental changes. Strake and Phelan argue that, quote, far-reaching change can be accomplished through the accumulation of small, often seemingly insignificant adjustments. They propose 5 ways in which gradual processes can have transformative effect: through the displacement of existing policies, the layering of new policies on top of old ones, policy drift, the conversion of old policies beyond their original purpose, and the exhaustion of old policies. All of these changes have implications for institutional transformation. But in the rest of this talk, I'll focus on only one mechanism, what I call spillover. Policy changes that demonstrate a shift from national security to domestic policy and domestic institutions. In particular, I'll look at the militarization of the police through the creation of a police complex, the growth in the government's practice of contracting out state practices to private actors, the expansion of the state secret doctrine in civil court, and the use of classified evidence in these cases, and the terrorist-inspired tightening of immigration policy. First, the militarization of the police. Well before 9/11, American policing, which is traditionally local, began to be a focus of national politics. Charles Epp has traced the growth of public spending on policing in American cities since 1960. Epp's data shows considerable increases in the proportion of local spending devoted to the police. His work also shows that there's been an increasing intermixing of federal, state, and local policing activities, leading to the formation of what he calls the police complex. Although the trend that Epp traces began with the response to the civil unrest of the 1960s, it accelerated after 9/11. For example, under a Defense Department program for distributing used war material, local and state police departments were given military-style uniforms, armored vehicles, and drones for street policing. A notable example is the expansion of police special weapons and tactics teams, which were first instituted after the Los Angeles riots in the 1960s, but began to be used increasingly for routine policing. Their use accelerated substantially after the attacks of 9/11. While there were roughly 3,000 SWAT raids in 1980, by 2006 their number had grown to 50,000. By 2012, there were as many as 80,000 such raids. After 9/11, many cities and states began to use their police forces to collect intelligence. The most extensive of these were deployed by the New York City Police Department. Federal agencies also expanded their reach into the American states and localities through the creation of what they called fusion centers. Combining the efforts of state, local, and national intelligence agencies for gathering and collating intelligence. The Department of Homeland Security lists 79 of these fusion centers, many of them in major metropolitan areas, but some as far away as Puerto Rico and the island of Guam in the Pacific. These fusion centers were intended to identify terrorist suspects, but once in place, their activities began to diffuse to the surveillance of domestic protesters. Further from the field of national security than policing is what Donald Kettle calls government by proxy, the provision of government goods and services through contractors, grantees, and recipients of government tax breaks. In part because it came on the heels of the Reagan-era retraction of the state, and in part because Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld reduced the size of the military, a vast parastate sector has grown up around the government's security functions. As Linda Weiss writes, the war on terror provided new motivation and momentum for national security state-led technology development in fields including robotics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, cybersecurity, and renewable energy. Here are some examples of firms subsidized by the federal government since 9/11. Many of these contractors work in traditional sectors of national security, for example, producing goods for the use of the military. But in recent years, the CIA and other government agencies have been investing in a range of companies investing in other areas with civilian applications. These companies' products have obvious security applications, but they're designed to monitor online platforms that can spot gang incidents, identify threats to journalists, and predict events in the future. In their book, Dana Priest and William Arkin found that thousands of contractors are working alongside military officers in shopping malls and office complexes around the company. For example, near the National Security Agency headquarters, more than 250 companies have taken root since 9/11. As Alison Staniel writes, employees of private military firms answer neither to the U.S. military nor to the indigenous population they're involved in defending. They answer to the company that employs them. Following from this expansion of government by proxy is the ability of private litigants to use the state secrets doctrine for corporate purposes in court. The claim of secret law has been most famously levied in recent years against classified opinions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Corps and against classified or unreleased Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel opinions on interrogation, surveillance, and targeted killings. But that's only part of the picture. Defense contractors being sued in civil court have been permitted to use the claim that evidence against them cannot be used in court because it might expose classified information. So imagine that you are a company that has invented a new kind of widget. And I go to court and I say that I invented that widget and that you have stolen my invention. If that widget has security applications, and if the development of the widget has been subsidized by the CIA, you can claim that the information about the widget is part of the state secrets. For corporate reasons, I can use the state secret document to disguise the technical process through which I produced my widget. Laura Donahue has collected data on the extent to which private litigants have begun to use the state secret doctrine to shield their records when challenged in court. Donahue found that the doctrine has evolved into a powerful litigation tool to undermine contractual obligations and to pervert tort law, creating a form of private indemnity for government contractors in a broad range of areas. Similarly, in the context of criminal prosecutions, the government has used the Classified Information Procedures Act to request authorization to delete specific items of classified information from the discovery process. Under SIPA, a defendant can even be excluded from a hearing in which the court decides on the admissibility of classified information. SIPA, as Brooks points out, is not new, but in the post-9/11 context, the government has been classifying documents at an unprecedented pace. As Ellen Yarshofsky writes, secret evidence is seeping into the criminal justice system. Europeans will have seen on television the alarming accusations of Donald Trump about immigrants from Mexico. I won't try and do an imitation of Trump presenting these ideas, but he did say that when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you, they're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems. And they're bringing these problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. Trump never made the link explicit between the fear of terrorism and the anti-immigrant wave that has swept the United States since 9/11. But his vice presidential candidate, as recently as last week, argued that the state of Indiana, of which he is governor, will not accept any further refugees from Syria because they may be terrorists. And interestingly enough, the case was decided in the Court of Appeals in Chicago by a conservative jurist, Richard Posner, just yesterday, and the court ruled against Governor Pence. Two sociologists presented a paper at the sociological meetings in Seattle in August, Luis Romero and Anita Tarrow, and they studied 15 years' worth of speeches and government documents that showed the pervasiveness of this link between terrorism and immigration and its effects on Latinos. Only months after the 9/11 attacks, congressmen started warning of porous borders and framing almost any migrant at the U.S.-Mexican border as a potential terrorist threat. Part of the reason for this spillover was because the Immigration and Nationalization Service was moved from the Department of Labor to the Department of Homeland Security. Securitization in action. Since the creation of DHS in 2003, the government has deported an average of 334,000 people a year, far more than in any year since 2001. Despite the president's call for an amnesty for people he called the dreamers, that is, the children of illegal immigrants who were born in the United States, Obama has deported more than 2.5 million people, including 438,000 in 2013 alone, when tens of thousands of unaccompanied children fled north from violence in Central America. So how to conclude? Rosa Brooks ended her essay on the Trickle-Down War with a hope that would inspire additional efforts to map the spillovers of the War on Terror in a more comprehensive manner, challenging as that task may be. This has been intended to contribute to that effort. But if anything, this talk has indicated how difficult the task is going to be, since spillover policies, unlike Schmittian policies, are submerged and escape the Schmittian idea that sovereignty is whatever the sovereign wants it to mean. Do not misunderstand me. The fact that 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were herded into concentration camps during World War II suggests that the American state is capable of despotic power as well. But there was a rollback effect to that constitutional change. At war's end, led by Japanese American groups and by the American Civil Liberties Union, a civil society movement for redress brought about a shift in state policy. In 1976, President Gerald Ford apologized publicly for the harms caused to the internees. And until Donald Trump came on the scene, no actual or potential American leader even hinted that suspect minority populations should be sanctioned en bloc out of fear that some small number of them might engage in sabotage or espionage. In Mark Tushnet's account, a process of social learning took place, as a result of which the threat to civil liberties posed by government actions has diminished in successive wartime emergencies. Now compare the rollback of Korematsu to the kinds of changes I've been talking about under the general rubric of spillover. In all four areas I've looked at, institutional change has been taking place incrementally, helped in part by government secrecy, but also by the submerged nature of the changes involved. The danger of such incremental change lies not in a sudden Schmittian transformation to an emergency regime, but from the gradual and partially invisible transformation of existing practice. Much as the British are said to have conquered India by a gradual process of tidying up the border. Let me close with a brief reflection on an incremental change that you will know better than I do. During an earlier emergency, the 1970s and 80s, in Germany, 10 amendments to the criminal code granted the German police and judiciary an increasing number of instruments to respond to the rise and persistence of small groups of domestic terrorists. Most draconian was Article 129A of the Penal Code, which, as Peter Katzenstein writes, granted state officials broad discretionary powers that they had not enjoyed before, punishing intent and motivation even in the absence of suspicion of criminal activity. Was there a spillover of these penal reforms in Germany at the end of that emergency? Well, yes and no. Yes, because in 1987, Article 129A was broadened to the suppression of radical, anarchist, and frequently violent fringes of the anti-nuclear movement. Germany was also among the first states to employ large-scale computer matching to allow investigators to identify overlapping clusters of suspicious traits. I'm quoting Katzenstein here. Abstract categories defined by the police, rather than concrete indications of involvement in specific terrorist crimes, thus are decisive for initiating police work. This included trolling through records of utility companies, checking on residence and automobile permits, and comparing those to Social Security and child care payments. But no, the spillover was limited because the decades since the 1970s have seen a relative restrained use of these instruments, as Katzenstein also points out. As domestic terrorism subsided and German society became more liberal, the conviction rate of suspects charged under Article 129A was extremely low, and the instruments through which they were identified tended to fall into disuse. Katzenstein notes that only 30 of the 2,700 preliminary investigations launched by federal prosecutors under Article 129A, little more than 1% led to convictions. Are Germans protected from the passive survival of a panoply of repressive instruments from the 1970s that are not used? Katzenstein is cautiously confident, but I'm not so sure. Incremental policy change can bring about institutional transformations when no one, or almost no one, is looking. Then, when a new emergency appears, these institutional changes are ready for employment by political elites who either fear terrorism or worry that opposition movements or parties will take advantage of that fear to threaten their hold on. The Korematsu case provides a warning. As Justice Jackson, who dissented from that decision, warned, once a judicial opinion rationalizes such an order to show that it conforms to the Constitution, the principle then lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a possible claim or an urgent need. What can be done to control such a loaded weapon? It's not liberal norms that will prevent it, as we saw in Korematsu and other cases in the United States, but only an alert and active civil society prepared to contest the threat to civil liberties with active legal and political mobilization. In War, States, and Contention, I documented this effort since 9/11 in the campaigns of the American Civil Liberties Union and the Center for Constitutional Rights against torture, illegal detention, and surveillance. I also examined the Snowden effect, which exposed the sweeping nature of the American surveillance state and has had effect both in America and here in Europe. I hope that civil society groups will arise to protect you all from the loaded weapon of authorities who can always bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need in the current or future emergencies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I first of all also want to say it's a huge honor for me and a pleasure to comment here on this lecture of Sidney. I have to also start with a confession, and my confession is that I just admire Sidney's work, and it was such a tremendous source of inspiration that it's also hard to challenge it. And I also have to make a confession that it was not easy to prepare today's comments, and for at least 3 reasons. And the first, you already have heard, that is about the content of the talk. It's a lot of details that come on the table that are still linked to analytical rigor, as in all of Sidney's work. The second reason is a bit, my modest contribution so far was on Europe and social movements. So take my kind of points a bit as an outsider's view on this field and the transformation of the American state. And finally, it's also not easy to just come up with kind of add-ons, what could follow out of this interesting piece that we've heard tonight, because as you're now all aware, there is great reading out there that already has many excellent answers on the follow-up questions that one could find on this talk. But let me still come to the content of today's lecture, as it teaches us quite some important lessons on the way states and political contention are transformed in times of critical junctures, here in the case of war. And I will kind of focus my small intervention into three points, and I've kind of labeled them a bit inspired by Sidney's works as dynamics, context, and then contention. First, I will say a bit about the status of the spillover mechanism and its relation to other processes of change. The second one is a bit about the comparative dimension and how much we can learn from the American state and what are kind of the scope conditions for the argument that you've presented this evening. And finally, then moving on to contentious politics and the consequences on contentious politics. Maybe, as you've now heard on the first point of spillover mechanisms, Sidney Tarrow has made once more a very nice kind of illustration of combining the thinking in terms of critical junctures with the steady flow of politics and how critical junctures intervene in so-called normal times. But what I think is also very important, that it comes out even more in the book than during the talk, how contested and politically constructed these critical events are and how many different actors shape the way these events then transform politics. And as you've heard tonight, the way Sidney discusses the transformation of the American state sets him very much apart from those who kind of overemphasize pronounced ruptures in the direction of a despotic state that just rules by some emergency script, as you've shown. But I would like to emphasize, and especially looking at the German discussion on the transformation of the state, it also sets you very much apart from those that focus more or put the emphasis on stability and non-directional kind of contradictory changes. And all that you've heard, I mean, there is a lot of contradiction and paradoxical developments in what you've presented, but there is a clear sign to the transformation and in the direction that this transformation takes us. And focusing on that direction of change, maybe we can take that up later in the discussion. A lot that you said reminded me a bit of my previous employment in Munich and Ulrich Beck's work on the World Risk Society and the rise of kind of preventive risk governance. So maybe we can go a bit in that direction. What is kind of the direction of change we witness and what does it mean? But here I would rather like to focus on the mechanism of change that you identify. And I think you're certainly right in emphasizing the key role of diffusion, defined as policy innovations that diffuse from one institutional sector to another. And while you discuss diffusion, it helped me also a lot in kind of reorganizing my own thoughts about how critical junctures can also differ from one another, because you raise kind of two, I think, important points. And the first one is that the changes induced by critical junctures often come in a less dramatic and visible way that many expect. As you said, you heavily rely on Wolfgang Streeck and Catherine Thielen's works. And this all kind of takes place below the radar of public debates and controversies. But I think what you also bring in and what you nicely kind of demonstrate is that if we're interested in the effects of critical events, we always have to combine a long-term and a short-term view of the developments. That is, one has to consider what kind of long-term changes were already underway long before this critical event actually happened. And I think by combining the two, there's either an immediate rupture or triggering more gradual changes, and the second distinction as intensifying long-term patterns of change or really reversing kind of the pattern of long-term change, leads us to kind of a nice combination of types of critical junctures where kind of one extreme would be a very intense immediate rupture that reverses the long-term processes of change, and the other one is more kind of a hidden acceleration of long-term trends that were already on the way before. I'm sorry. Now we're all awake again. So,
was that an intense critical juncture?
Yes, it was one of these ruptures that you're all now aware. But I will kind of proceed in the sequence that I had already. As planned. And why do I say all of this? Well, I say it because I would love, Sidney, somehow I do something wrong. I just have to sit here. I think what I would love you to reflect maybe in the discussion a bit more about is this, how the long-term processes that were shaping up in the American state and the... and this one.
Okay. You want to come closer to me?
Yes, I come to you.
This is getting very intimate.
Yeah.
Yes. Because...
in the middle.
What? By kind of reflecting maybe, or if we could discuss a bit more this long-term process and then kind of what 9/11 really did to this long-term process, we could get a bit closer to the status of spillover as the key mechanism. To be a bit more precise, I have like two main kind of points where I did not quite follow your talk. The first one is, when I understood you correctly, most of the changes that you actually identify as spillover were already kind of characterizing the American state long before 9/11, and it's a lot about the acceleration of these processes. And because you were talking about Streeck and Thielen's kind of mechanisms of gradual change, I was just reminded that layering actually is very much also part of the story that you have, that there are kind of different logics at work in a policy area, and just because one of them grows just much faster than all the others, it kind of reshapes the whole policy field. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit more, why kind of spillover and what is the relation of spillover to other forms of gradual change? And the second one, I think you're right in emphasizing the importance of spillover as a gradual transformation, and in your book you also focus a lot on infrastructural power, that this is an indication of infrastructural power, but at the same time you say in the American state both are on the rise, that is hierarchical power and infrastructural power. And there I was just wondering how much you see the intensity and the likelihood of spillover related to these transformations of hierarchical power. For example, can we imagine this closer linking of security concerns and the immigration debate without a Homeland Security department, or without kind of the installment of the Patriot Act, as that they kind of come first and then we see what you see? And I think this was just a bit because it sounded in part so pessimistic that I was just wondering if kind of if these major changes do not take place, can then these hidden changes still take place, or how much are they actually interconnected in the American case? So this was kind of my first point on what's really the role of spillover. And the second one is purely comparative politics, and it's a bit about the scope conditions of your argument. If you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that. And of course, I'm now here the discussant, although as I said, I'm just too much of an admirer to challenge you. But if I had to, I could say, how much is this really just American exceptionalism what we observe here. And as a comparative political scientist, then I would wonder what makes it that this American state is so particular and that we actually come up or end up in a situation that you describe a state that becomes so intrusive and not sensitive to civil liberties, while at the same time also more porous, incoherent, and vulnerable. So it's a very specific, almost paradoxical situation. And I've just listed 4 context conditions that we maybe could discuss later on. And the first one is really this professionalized army with no compulsory military service and the existence of a powerful military-industrial complex long before 9/11. And I think comparing it to European states, this clearly might make a difference in how easy, for example, military processes can spill over into other policy areas. Then the second one is a federal political system combined with a very strong non-statist tradition. Again, I think this makes it very likely, as you yourself also write, that the state relies on non-centralized means and public-private partnerships as long as it can. And I think all of this is also amplified, as you say in your book, by the strong anti-statist ideology of the ruling Republican Party at the moment when the critical juncture actually took place. And then the third element that maybe we could elaborate on is the role of the two-party system. What role would you give the two-party system for the transformation that we actually see? Because as you say, there was only kind of one major opposition player around, that was the Democratic Party, but it failed to deliver, and probably even worse, it even channeled the anti-war movement into the party, and then in the end also was a major trigger for its demobilization. So it's very rough and ready kind of comparative political science, but maybe if we could go a bit further in that direction. And I was just wondering, or I would love to hear a bit more how you see, for example, the French case in comparison. Because based on kind of these 3 factors, at least the one on the federal political system, the two-party system, but also the role of the military-industrial complex, it is a bit a different kind of system that really is opposed. But I think right now we see quite many of the same processes at work. But I was just wondering what take you have on that. So let me come to the final point of my intervention, and probably the one I feel a bit more secure talking about, and that is, as you said in your very nice kind of figure on the model that Charles Tilly came up with on war, states, citizenship, and then contentious politics, that you really brought contentious politics center stage. And I think if you read the book, you will see that Sidney really needs to be applauded, because he brings contentious politics and movements into the equation, not just as social movement scholars usually do in the form of the anti-war movement, but it's much more. It's different kinds of activism, starting from legal activism, individuals that play a role, but also movements that actually call for war or are very supportive for war. And I think this is one contribution, and the second one is also that you show how double-edged actually the nature of civil society can be. In the end, you kind of ended now with this positive statement that it's an alert and active civil society that should kind of bring us out of this pessimistic scenario, but at the same time you also reflect a lot about the penetration of the state into civil society and how hard it then becomes for civil society to mobilize if it is already part of the whole surveillance system itself. And I think here you, I think, rightly challenge Charles Tilly's more optimistic view on the relation between war-making, citizenship, and then the rise of contentious politics. But I have to say, while listening to your talk and reading the manuscript for that, I was even struck more by the pessimism you have than in the book, where, as you said, you kind of try to develop different forms this counter-mobilization could still take. But just going through all the spillover effects that you actually now describe, the militarization of the police, the reliance on state secrets in courts, the linkage of national security and immigration, and the outsourcing of military operations and surveillance, I can hardly read any opportunities for social movements. On the rise, it's mainly about threats, be it threats in terms of direct repression, the capacity for direct repression, the reduction of state funding and resources, limiting access to certain venues like courts, or at least limiting access to certain types of information. And then also, what I think is very important, limiting the discursive space for activism. And maybe we could reflect a bit more together also on the role of nationalism that is, I think, a very important part of your story, but it's not as kind of developed yet, that every kind of force that tries to fight for civil liberties and civil rights in this equation is actually perceived as anti-nationalist in the current moment. So if you could maybe elaborate a bit more, where should this actually come from, and what kind of signs do you see for a re-emerging alert civil society? And just to give you an example, as a European, I'm struck by the current protests against police brutality against the African Americans, and also the policing of these protest events. Is this part of the story here, or if we could maybe elaborate a bit on that? And then let me end this comment on moving to Europe. I was just thinking, is it really as different in Europe? And based on the previous work we did with Hans-Peter and Edgar, we see a lot of this kind of structuring of the political conflict around kind of these integrationist cosmopolitan positions already before kind of the main terrorist attacks took place. So I think what at least is harder probably in Europe, and we also see it right now in the migration and refugee crisis, that all of these processes are just below the radar, because it kind of feeds probably much more into an already pre-existing conflict line, where these universalist positions for civil liberties are really integrated in a very much pro-immigration, pro-European position. So this would be my kind of small grain of optimism, that at least it's not as hidden as it is in the American state. But it's all about curiosity and hearing your view on these points. Thank you very much, Sidney.
Thank you, Sven, for those very good, very right on target comments. And when we learned something, Sid, then admiration does not prevent from asking challenging questions. So it's your turn.
The admiration is mutual. I only wish that I had had a copy of your notes ahead of time so that I could have prepared to respond to really these very wonderful and thoughtful and thought-provoking comments. Maybe I could inspire you to write a review article based on what you were saying, and then I would have time to really reflect before trying to answer. It's always tempting to try and answer everything, especially in such a rich and complex set of thoughtful reactions, but I think I will probably try and save some time for the audience by just touching on a few points. The first point about spillover, and I think you correctly saw that it is a version of diffusion. And so diffusion theory might have carried me further in looking at this. I originally attempted to use the entire range of the Strake and Thielen mechanisms, all 5 of them, in examining post 9/11 United States, and then I realized that I would be writing another book, and it would be a Strake and Thielen book. And what I was hoping to do was simply illustrate the puzzle in response to the Schmittian, or rather the anti-Schmittian take on post 9/11 America. I wanted to illustrate that the United States is a very complicated country. There is a lot going on at the same time. Not all of it
moving in the same direction. And spillover from one sector to another is a particularly interesting process because American politics is so segmented. When we think of the way the American state is organized, for example, we have what's called a Department of the Interior, but the Department of the Interior has nothing to do with policing. It administers the national parks and a number of other natural resources. We don't have the equivalent of a Ministry of the Interior in the United States. We have 14,000 local police forces and 50 state police forces and 3 or 4 different federal police forces operating to some extent at cross purposes with one another. So a spillover in this highly segmented state struck me as a really remarkable phenomenon because it's so difficult to bring about a spillover when the state itself is so segmented. And that was why I focused on this rather broad mechanism of spillover. Parenthetically, I realized when Peter Katzenstein read a draft of this paper, I realized that I had been influenced by my training in international relations where I studied with Ernst Haas. And Peter pointed out that the concept of spillover comes from Haas, which he used in his early study of the European community. And my first response was to say, this has nothing to do with the United States. Haas was writing about Europe in the 1950s, and yet there was a parallel, because what Haas was talking about was the spillover of Europeanization from one sector to another. And this was essentially what I was looking at. And so that was why I focused on spillover rather than on these other mechanisms, all of which have been very carefully studied. My, not polemic, but my opposition to the Schmittian approach to 9/11 was the result of being an outsider like yourself. I, after all, came to this as a Europeanist. The last article I wrote on American politics was my master's thesis in 1962. So I was an outsider. And when I began to read legal theorists who were quoting Schmitt as the authority on what was happening to the United States after 9/11, I said, it doesn't look like that to me. As a Europeanist, when I think of Schmitt, I think of National Socialism. I think of Italian fascism. I don't think of the USA Patriot Act. I don't even think of the decision to torture detainees, which was one of the most horrible effects of 9/11, because that was done in a legal way. It's quite striking that legality was so important to the Bush administration that they insisted that the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel find a legal rationale for torture. Now, we know that it was a made-up legal rationale, but it indicates how far they were from the idea that the rule of law is what the sovereign says it is. So I was, in a way, in a polemic against people who I agreed with politically. These were people on the left who were saying, be careful, you'll end up with Schmitt. But that's not what I saw. What I saw was an awful lot of apparently detached, different phenomena occurring through infrastructural power. And that was when I rediscovered Michael Mann's work, which I hadn't read for many years. Michael Mann is somebody who gave very little attention to the United States. He was very European-oriented. But the concept of infrastructural power, which he developed in the first volume of his book, which was about the medieval period in Europe, the concept of infrastructural power struck me as highly relevant to a state governed by an ideology of the dominance of the market, in which the state and private actors are operating in tandem. And it was then that I discovered the work of Linda Weiss, who was a student of Michael Mann's, who studied the national security state starting in the 1950s and discovered this vast panoply of relationships between private and public actors, many of which had gone unnoticed by students of public policy. And as I began to dig deeper and to look at the growth of these public-private relationships, I discovered that they were not evidence of despotic power because they gave as much power to the private actors as they did to the public actors. So this was not corporatism in the European sense. This was the exercise of infrastructural power within American civil society, and that gave me both a way of looking at the United States since 9/11, but also it gave me the small glimmer of optimism that you found in chapter 9 of the book. Because the same civil society that has produced Blackwater and a number of military industrial firms that have been carrying on warfare under the banner of patriotism, that same infrastructural power allows the development of civil society groups that have been challenging those efforts. So it is a pessimistic book, but it also has glimmers of optimism, as you, I think, intuited. And chapter 9 of the book, which I couldn't talk about in detail here, chapter 9 shows the many ways in which the American state has been held in check, has been monitored, and to some extent corrected in its transformation into a warfare state. Now, you asked me to try and say something about Europe and the scope conditions of the book, and I confess that, as you know, the part of the book that's about Europe ends in 1922. And the whole second half of the book begins in 1945, and it's only about the United States. But you are not the first one to ask me if I would consider the United States exceptional. And if it is exceptional, what is it that makes it exceptional? I'm not sure I can answer that with confidence, but what I think I can say is that I don't know a single European state that is as segmented and disorganized as the American state. And I speak as a former Italianist. So the Italian state may be more corrupt than the American state. It may be less efficient than the American state, but it doesn't even come near the degree of segmentation and disorganization of the American state. And this is why I would hesitate to expand the scope conditions of the study to countries like France or Germany. You argue that there are in Europe processes that are below the radar as well, and I don't doubt it for a moment. What I would be curious about is whether European, and in particular German, public policy is as permissive as American public policy. For the colloquium that I've I'm going to be speaking to in the Global Governance Group on Thursday, I chose to focus on privacy and on the transnational and transatlantic relations among privacy protection groups in response to the threat of government intrusion. And what I was struck by was the degree to which Europeans are far more protective of this particular crucial civil liberty, privacy, than Americans. And why is that? Why is it that countries that have a much longer and stronger statist tradition are more protective of privacy than a country which prides itself for its First Amendment? I don't know the answer to that, but one thing has to do with the hegemony of the market. In the United States, privacy is considered as very important, but the market is considered even more important. And that makes me wonder if the scope conditions of my study can be broadened to include Europe. It makes me wonder if Europeans would be as permissive of the abuses that have occurred in wartime to the United States after 9/11. That only does a little bit of responding to your excellent questions, Sven, so thank you very much.
Before I open for the audience, Sid, let me just dwell on two of the issues raised by Swen. And the first one is, again, pushing you even a little bit further on this relationship between spillover and the different ways of gradual transformation identified by Thiel and Streeck. Here in one sense, I felt you are saying, well, spillover is an additional mechanism. But then on the other hand, I thought, if you talk about things like displacement, layering, conversion, this seems to me, as used by those two, ways to describe the development away from the status quo, how something has changed, how a certain policy has changed, either by layering or by conversion or by replacement. If we talk about spillover, I do have the feeling we talk a lot about where does the change come from, not necessarily what is the change and how does the change look like. In that sense, it seems to me the way you use this term spillover and diffusion points exactly in this direction is something that tells us about the causes, the developments, the mechanisms, how those policy changes come about, but not so much what kind of policy changes these are and whether these policy changes do really lead to a transformation, to a gradual transformation. There I just would like to push you a little bit further on this relationship between spillover and those other mechanisms. And that is, I think, directly connected to the second question, also taking up something that Sven brought up, contentious politics. If we see it the way Sven has suggested, that this is not something that a state not controlled by society does in order to get control over the society, but if we see it as an outcome of an ongoing struggle between two camps in almost all Western societies. One of them is defending liberalism, is defending openness. The other one is saying, well, there are so many dangers out in this world, we have to protect ourselves and we have to do some things which undermine our freedom. If you see it in this way, then of course the question is who wins, and is it a permanent development that goes into one direction? And there would be the possibility of rollback or of stop of such a development. And here my concrete question, if you look at the scheme that you used by Scheperle, the script, has it not stopped somewhere? Did it not go the full way through? I would, for example, but correct me, I would, for example, say, protection of free speech is still not really attacked in the United States. And that I think I was the fourth or the fifth point in this development. So the question is, did it not stop? And if it stopped, is it not the result that for 8 years now, the other part of this cleavage had at least some control over the government?
So actually it was my doubt about Shepley's scheme that started me puzzling and worrying about the applicability of the Schmittian model. Because if you looked down her list, you could see evidence of the first 3 or possibly 4 of her mechanisms, but certainly free speech is still alive and well. There has been no effective militarization of society, although there has been a militarization of the police. There are a number of ways in which this doesn't look like a sequence to me. And moreover, what Shepley is talking about is a scheme which involves the entire state. And that's not what I see in the United States. What I see is sectors of the state that have been responsive to securitization and other sectors that have not been responsive. I'll give you one small but really very indicative example. In the USA Patriot Act, there is a sector which allows the FBI to investigate individuals for what the law calls business purposes. So the intention was to examine the budgets of businesses to see if they were contributing to terrorism. The FBI interpreted this business purposes very broadly to include, are you ready for this? The books that people were taking out of the public library. Now, we are shocked by this. Most Americans were not shocked by it. Most Americans didn't even know it was happening. But there was a civil society group, the American Librarians Association, whose job is not to defend civil liberties, but to defend the interests of librarians. But they knew about this, and they objected to it, and they managed to get the practice stopped. So it's a complicated matter, and there isn't any overall schema that helps us to understand it. And in answer to your first point, I think where my approach to spillover is different than Strake and Thielen is that when you look at Strake and Thielen's cases, all of those are cases within individual policy areas. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the shift between policy areas, which bring about a diffusion of securitization from the national security sector to other sectors. Strake and Thielen should not be blamed for not looking at national security. They do a lot of wonderful work with social and economic policy, with planning, for example, with welfare. But they didn't look at national security policy, and as a result, the spillover from that into domestic policy is really outside the scheme of their research.
Thanks. I want to give you now the opportunity to ask questions. We have mics here in the room, which can be distributed to those who have questions. It would be great if you could briefly introduce yourself, and then you can ask questions either to Sid or to Sven or to both of them. These are the rules. Why don't you start?